On July 3, 1979, U.S. President Jimmy Carter signed the first covert directive authorizing the CIA to begin secret aid to Afghan resistance fighters battling the communist-backed government in Kabul. That small step, approved quietly and shielded even from most congressional scrutiny, ignited what later became known as Operation Cyclone, one of the longest and most expensive covert CIA missions in history. Unlike traditional warfare, this was a conflict waged in shadows. No declared soldiers, no marked fronts, just intelligence officers, satellite eyes, and weapon crates routed through unmarked convoys. The decision came months before the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. It was based on growing fears inside the CIA and National Security Council that Moscow was expanding its influence deeper into Central Asia. The Afghan border region, harsh, mountainous, and scarcely governed, was identified as a strategic choke point. Langley analysts had repeatedly pointed out that if the Soviet army reached Pakistan's frontier, it would threaten the balance of power across the Middle East and potentially the Persian Gulf. CIA Director Stansfield Turner approved initial funding estimated at $500,000, funneled covertly through Pakistan's Inter-Services Intelligence Agency, ISI. The funds were meant for propaganda and non-lethal assistance. It was modest, but within a year, the mission expanded rapidly, with the Reagan administration later escalating it to a billion-dollar covert program during the 1980s. The Americans understood one thing clearly: boots-on-ground deployment would trigger international outcry. Instead, the CIA sought to build networks, arming, training, and advising local Afghan mujahideen via ISI handlers. The program focused on supply routes threading through rugged border passes near Peshawar and the Khyber Pass. The terrain was brutal: high altitudes, rock-strewn valleys, winding tracks monitored by Soviet helicopters. Here, intelligence, not manpower, was the weapon. By late 1979, CIA field officers began discreet visits to Pakistan, meeting ISI operatives in safe houses in Rawalpindi and Islamabad. They dissected Soviet radio chatter, studied road networks, and discussed arms distribution. Initially, only vintage rifles and limited anti-tank weapons were provided. But after the Soviet invasion in December 1979, priorities changed. The CIA started allocating sophisticated reconnaissance tools and later, following heavy debate in Washington, shoulder-fired Stinger missiles, which would alter the conflict dramatically. The Afghan border became a clandestine map of staging zones. Local tribal leaders, operating with near-total autonomy, transported equipment via mule caravans at night. U.S. satellite passes were timed to monitor Soviet troop buildup, while ISI teams coordinated guerrilla strikes. The CIA avoided direct combat involvement, but internal cables show that some officers pushed for limited on-site advisory roles during peak Soviet offensives. This was the birth of modern remote espionage, surveillance satellites guiding guerrilla warfare, encrypted radio relays replacing command tents, and intelligence steering conflict without conventional armies. And somewhere in those dusty passes, a new era of warfare quietly began, one where the most decisive battles were fought without uniforms. By 1980, the CIA had transformed the Afghan conflict into a prototype for intelligence-driven war. Langley analysts, once constrained to static Cold War observation, were now directing active battlefield strategy through satellite reconnaissance and real-time signal intercepts. High-resolution images from K-11 spy satellites were transmitted to secure analysis rooms within the CIA facility in Northern Virginia. These images revealed Soviet supply routes, armored personnel carrier convoys, and occasionally helicopter landing points deep inside Afghan valleys. Once flagged, the intelligence was forwarded to ISI headquarters in Rawalpindi, where it was then passed to selected mujahideen units operating near the Kunar, Nangarhar, and Khost regions. At the same time, NSA teams monitored Soviet military frequencies using listening posts installed across the Pakistan-Afghanistan border. These stations, often disguised as telecommunications towers, provided early warning of Soviet airstrikes. Mujahideen fighters would then retreat into cave networks or shift weapon caches before Mi-24 Hind helicopters could strike. To enhance adaptability, MI6 joined the operation, helping train ISI officers in clandestine communication techniques and sabotage planning. Unlike previous intelligence collaborations, this effort relied heavily on external actors, tribal fighters, smugglers, and border settlers, enabling deniability at every stage. The CIA's role remained officially unacknowledged. But as the intelligence chain tightened, the battlefield began to move according to satellite passes and signal intercepts rather than troop columns. The war was no longer about territory. It was about information. And the agency that controlled the information would soon redefine power itself. By 1985, Soviet air superiority had become the single most devastating obstacle for Afghan resistance. The Mi-24 Hind attack helicopters, heavily armored and equipped for low-altitude missions, decimated Mujahideen positions, supply lines, and border crossings with relentless precision. Intelligence from satellite tracking confirmed the trend. Soviet airstrikes were responsible for over 60% of Mujahideen losses in key regions like Kunar and Panjshir. The CIA's remote intelligence strategy had reached its limit. Without direct disruption of air dominance, the covert war risked failure. Inside Washington, the debate was fierce. Some officials feared that supplying advanced anti-aircraft weapons, such as the Stinger, could provoke direct Soviet retaliation against the United States or Pakistan. Others argued that without such game-changing support, Operation Cyclone would stagnate. CIA Director William J. Casey was among the strongest advocates, pushing for the introduction of the missile. Internal memos from mid-1985 show Casey emphasizing that denying air control will alter the psychological and operational balance of the conflict. After high-level authorization from the Reagan administration, the CIA initiated limited distribution of FIM-92 Stinger missiles in 1986. Due to deniability concerns, American personnel were not permitted across the border. Instead, small JSOC-linked detachments discreetly trained Pakistani ISI operatives near Peshawar, who then instructed selected Afghan teams. Each unit was trained to maintain tight operational secrecy. If captured, they were to deny any connection to U.S. intelligence. In September 1986, during a Soviet assault in the Kunar region, the first operational use of the Stinger was recorded. An Afghan unit led by Commander Gabudin Hekmatyar reportedly engaged two Mi-24 helicopters. Soviet pilot logs and field reports confirmed that one helicopter was shot down and another damaged. It marked the first verified instance of Soviet air loss due to the Stinger. Impact was immediate and substantial. Over the next 12 months, more than 270 Soviet aircraft were reportedly downed or forced to retreat, with U.S. intelligence estimating Stinger success rates above 80% in optimal conditions. Satellite imagery showed reduced helicopter deployment in high-risk zones. NSA intercepts recorded increased Soviet cautionary radio traffic. One transmission translated by CIA analysts noted, "Do not fly below ridge line, American weapons spotted." The Stinger not only changed tactics, it changed perception. Insurgency morale surged. Between late 1986 and 1987, guerrilla attacks increased by nearly 50% in border-adjacent areas. Logistical routes reopened. Soviet supply convoys faced growing harassment. Analysts at Langley began documenting a reversal trajectory. The Soviet military was now reacting instead of dictating. Operation Cyclone had crossed a threshold. This was no longer indirect assistance, but technological intervention with strategic consequences. By 1984, Operation Cyclone had grown too large to depend solely on traditional intelligence channels. What began as a limited covert directive had evolved into one of the most complex illicit logistics campaigns in modern espionage history. To maintain deniability while scaling support, the CIA built a global procurement ecosystem, one that relied on shell corporations, diplomatic channels, Middle Eastern financial banks, and discrete arms brokers operating from Europe to Southeast Asia. Declassified CIA budget reports reveal that by 1985, annual funding had reached approximately $250 million, matching contributions from Saudi Arabia, which agreed to co-finance the mission in 50-50 parity. These funds flowed through carefully engineered banking structures, predominantly routed via accounts in Dubai and Kuwait, then transferred to Pakistani ISI-controlled channels. U.S. officials, including Congressman Charlie Wilson, played key behind-the-scenes roles in lobbying for expanded budgets. Arms procurement was equally intricate. U.S. weapons were occasionally purchased through reverse procurement, using third-party vendors in Egypt and China to avoid direct attribution. Soviet-designed weapons were also sourced to better align with local familiarity. Many were obtained through black market dealers in former Warsaw Pact countries. MI6 intelligence officers discreetly facilitated certain acquisitions through European arms brokers, exploiting the lack of regulatory oversight during the Cold War. Transporting these weapons into Afghanistan presented its own challenge. The majority moved through secret overland convoys from Karachi port, crossing into tribal regions near Peshawar and the Para-Khyber sector under ISI supervision. The CIA referred to these covert lines as rat routes in operational documentation, a nod to their use of unmarked trucks, nocturnal movement, and temporary fuel depots hidden within remote villages. Bribes to local tribal warlords ensured safe passage. To protect U.S. involvement, front companies were established, often incorporated in Switzerland, Luxembourg, and the Cayman Islands. These firms legally purchased equipment on paper, while intelligence officers used diplomatic pouches and military cargo flights to relocate sensitive items. Some declassified records reference the use of non-attributable assets, including unregistered cargo planes contracted via intermediaries. Meanwhile, in Islamabad, ISI's Special Technical Division orchestrated distribution, while CIA officers monitored progress from secure liaison stations. Though no American was permitted to cross the border, field notes from that era confirm occasional informal meetings between CIA operatives and Afghan commanders at secluded compounds on the Pakistani side. The network was effective, but at a cost. Increased activity attracted counterintelligence efforts. Soviet KGB and GRU operatives attempted to infiltrate arms caravans and intercept communication lines. Several routes were compromised in 1986, prompting intensified encryption protocols and stricter compartmentalization. CIA command restructured the operation to function on a need-to-know basis, minimizing risk from leaks. By 1988, the covert supply infrastructure supporting Afghan resistance was unprecedented in scope. No conventional military campaign had ever been sustained solely through intelligence coordination. By 1988, the Soviet Union was preparing its military exit from Afghanistan under the Geneva Accords, and Operation Cyclone had fulfilled its immediate objective, forcing a superpower out through sustained guerrilla resistance. Yet inside CIA headquarters, analysts had already begun drafting warning briefs. A classified document dated late 1988 outlined the risk of uncontrolled ideologically motivated factions acquiring disproportionate influence in post-conflict Afghanistan. Another assessment from early 1989 predicted power struggles between mujahideen groups unless stabilization and reconstruction were prioritized. Instead, funding and oversight rapidly declined. As the Cold War wound down, congressional support for high-risk covert operations diminished. The CIA began a gradual reduction in field engagement, while ISI maintained strong ties with certain factions, especially those aligned with its strategic goals. This withdrawal left a fragmented military infrastructure in place, filled with combat-hardened fighters and vast quantities of weapons, including high-value arms originally supplied for anti-Soviet warfare. One of the most concerning developments was the emergence of foreign volunteer fighters who had traveled to Afghanistan during the conflict, motivated by ideological commitment. Among them were Arab militants supported indirectly through regional donors during the war. Though early CIA internal reports indicate that the agency did not initially consider these figures a primary threat, concerns escalated after fighters began consolidating influence in the eastern border regions. In 1989, shortly after the Soviet withdrawal, internal U.S. embassy cables from Islamabad noted that Pakistani border towns such as Peshawar had become transit hubs for ideologically driven elements entering Afghan territories. Unverified reports described training camps emerging around Khost and Helmand provinces. The CIA's post-operation review warned that the same logistical networks developed to move weapons and resources during the war could now empower non-state actors. Compounding the issue, factional infighting among Afghan leaders intensified. Ahmad Shah Massoud, operating mainly in the Panjshir Valley, and Gulbuddin Hekmatyar, a major recipient of ISI support, became embroiled in conflict over political ascendancy. Cities such as Kabul, Jalalabad, and Kandahar suffered significant destruction during the civil clashes that followed. CIA situation reports from late 1991 documented artillery shelling between rival groups using weapons provided during the anti-Soviet campaign. Meanwhile, in the U.S., attention shifted to post-Cold War policy realignment. Budget reductions meant reduced surveillance of the region. A 1992 CIA memorandum, now declassified, stated, "Strategic disengagement has allowed operational channels to remain unchecked. Regional powers, including Pakistan and Saudi Arabia, continue to influence internal Afghan affairs through select factions." By 1992, the humanitarian costs were severe. Over 1 million Afghan civilians displaced, with the border cities of Quetta and Peshawar hosting large refugee populations. The CIA concluded that while Operation Cyclone achieved its tactical objective, it failed to implement long-term intelligence containment. The mission that changed modern espionage also exposed its limitations. The war had ended, but the intelligence networks remained active, now operating without oversight. When the last Soviet armored vehicle crossed the Amu Darya River in early 1989, it marked the end of one war, but not the end of the conflict. The CIA had achieved the tactical goal of Operation Cyclone, pushing a superpower into retreat. But inside Langley, analysts were already preparing reports that warned of something new. Afghanistan was splintering, and the same structures built for covert warfare were now operating without guidance. The United States began disengaging from the region by 1992. Funding declined. Intelligence teams were downsized. Pakistan's ISI maintained influence over certain factions, while Afghanistan descended into a brutal civil struggle between former allies. Commanders who once fought side by side against Soviet forces now competed for power using weapons supplied during the operation. It was a direct consequence of rapid disengagement, something several CIA analysts had cautioned against. In 1994, a new force emerged in Kandahar. They called themselves the Taliban. U.S. diplomatic cables from Islamabad described them as a religiously driven movement promising to restore order. At first, intelligence assessments did not categorize them as a major threat. What went largely unnoticed was that their ranks included fighters who had trained along the very same covert routes established a decade earlier, and they were now consolidating control over them. By 1995, the CIA began tracking Taliban advances. Reports indicated that the group was taking control of former Mujahideen supply lines and compounds. Analysts noted the significance but lacked an operational framework to counter it. The United States, having withdrawn strategic interest after the Cold War, had no structured re-engagement plan. A cautionary cable that year stated simply, "They inherit what we built. We no longer direct it." In 1996, the Taliban captured Kabul. That same year, Osama bin Laden relocated from Sudan to Afghanistan, forming an alliance with Taliban leadership. A 1996 CIA memo referenced concern over his presence, but acknowledged limited visibility into long-term intentions. The covert infrastructure built for fighting a declared enemy now provided shelter to an undeclared one. By 1998, after the bombings of the U.S. embassies in Kenya and Tanzania, the urgency escalated. Intelligence traced operational planning back to camps in Afghanistan. Missile strikes followed under Operation Infinite Reach. Analysts confirmed that some targets were located within zones originally used as staging areas during Operation Cyclone. One internal NSA report noted, "The same trails that moved rifles now move resolve." Warnings increased in 1999 and 2000. The CIA elevated Afghanistan to a high-threat priority, and analysts began calling for a renewed ground network. But without established assets or on-the-ground infrastructure, actionable intelligence was limited. A redacted 2000 briefing summarized it openly: "Control without presence collapses into consequence." Then came September 11, 2001. In the aftermath, CIA teams urgently reviewed historical records of the Afghan operation. A post-crisis report concluded that while the operation had succeeded in undermining Soviet expansion, it failed to include post-conflict containment. "We showed that intelligence could replace armies. We did not consider what happens when those trained under intelligence begin operating beyond it." From 2002 onward, U.S. intelligence doctrine shifted completely. Satellite support was no longer just for battlefield observation. It became the backbone of remote counterterrorism. Drone warfare replaced passive surveillance. Joint intelligence task forces were created to avoid compartmentalization failures seen in the earlier program. Proxy warfare was drastically reduced in favor of direct operational control. In 2003, an internal CIA strategic directive issued during reform stated, "The Afghan war introduced the era of intelligence-led warfare. Its aftermath introduced the era of intelligence-led risk." Operation Cyclone had demonstrated that wars could be won without armies, but also that conflicts could emerge from systems operating beyond oversight. The most effective intelligence networks of the 1980s were never meant to last. Yet long after funding stopped, weapons moved. Fighters organized. Influence shifted. And the borderlands that once served as conduits against the Soviet Union became the starting point of a new global threat. This was the war where intelligence replaced conventional deployment, where satellites guided strategy, and where deniable operations reshaped geopolitics. But it was also the war that revealed a critical truth: victory without supervision is temporary. And the same data, routes, and networks that disrupt empires can, if left unattended, construct crises. From barren passes in the Khyber to secure intelligence rooms in Langley, this was the mission that changed modern espionage. And even today, the echoes of that operation continue to influence global security, proving that while intelligence can build battlefield success, it must also build what comes after it. Because when wars end, intelligence doesn't disappear. It shifts, sometimes in ways no one intended.